In the absence of any other member standing, I call Joe Swinson to start the wind-ups.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Hancock. And first of all, I would like to congratulate the Honourable Member for the Wrekin for leading and introducing this debate, and indeed for securing this debate to start with. I know it was a matter that he raised at Business Questions in order to get the debate here today, which I think is important for us to be discussing, particularly in the light of recent events and indeed forthcoming events in Belarus, for us to be able to discuss this matter before the House goes into recess. I know the Honourable Member takes a keen interest in political affairs within Eastern Europe and indeed Russia, and would commend his work as chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Russia, and indeed for introducing me to the Russian ambassador, I think last month, which was a very interesting meeting to have. And of course, I would just start by sharing entirely his condemnation of the recent bomb attacks in Minsk, which are very distressing, and the results or the reasons behind them have not necessarily been got to the bottom of. And I think I would also share his slight fear and trepidation about the way that the Belarus authorities might go about conducting such investigations and the results that they might have because of that, given the appalling record in human rights and the decent law and order within the country. In the 18 years that Belarus has been ruled by Alexander Lukashenko, it has been really quite clear that this is now the last place in Europe where there is a dictator, and indeed the US have described it as an outpost of tyranny. Of course, Belarus used to be relatively prosperous when it was part of the USSR, and unfortunately, since the end of the Soviet Union, has been in steep decline. I think what's important for us to remember here today is that it's the Belarusian people who are the important ones, and they are the ones who have been the victim of the tyranny of Lukashenko and his regime cracking down on dissidents and managing the country in an incredibly poor way, so that they are actually suffering the consequences, and the economy there is just crumbling and, as was referred to, very much looking towards the past rather than looking towards the future. The regime has been characterised by huge amounts of human rights abuses, and particularly when it comes to political opposition and the way that dissidents have been treated. All of the institutions have been subverted to the will of the President, and indeed, worryingly, just even over the past couple of months, there has been even more rigid legislation to put a muzzle on the country's independent media. By any stretch of the imagination, one of the hallmarks of states that wish to oppress their people. As a result of these human rights abuses, it finds itself increasingly isolated in the international community, and indeed increasingly dependent on its relations with Russia. But I think it's important for us to make the point that it's also vital that the relations with the EU can be put onto a better footing, and the twin track strategy is something which I hope to ask the Minister about. There's three main areas I would like to focus on: the democracy and human rights in Belarus, the relations with the EU, and its relations with Russia. But just before I move on to those topics, I just wanted to sort of share one slightly related topic. Belarus is not necessarily a country that would be very familiar to many people within the UK, but in fact I would say that there are more links than would necessarily be obvious at first glance. Indeed, when I mentioned to my PA Julie in my office that I would be speaking on a debate on Belarus, she pointed out that in fact when she was growing up as a child, for 6 months, two sisters had come to stay with her family and live with them as part of the many programmes which encourage children from Belarus to come to the UK to improve their health as a result of the Chernobyl disaster. And this is part of a programme that's been run by a variety of charities: Chernobyl Children's Lifeline, Chernobyl Children's Project UK, and about 4,000 children come here each year to have these kind of recuperative holidays, which have been proven to have a huge positive impact on health. Indeed, it's estimated that a stay of just a few weeks can extend life expectancy by as much as 2 years. So there are certainly more links than at first obvious. And these issues were also discussed in a Westminster Hall debate by my honourable friend, the member for Dunfermline, back in February. Particularly with regard to the problems for these children getting visas to come over as a result of the new biometric passports coming into force. having to go to Minsk to get the visa for some of these children who are understandably in a very ill state. That is a 10-hour round trip and is a great barrier to them being able to actually come on this holiday, which will help their health. Now, the Minister, who the member for East Renfrewshire, was present on that occasion, and he did say, and he was very strong in his remarks, he said he would take a personal interest and I will take personal responsibility for undertaking further inquiries and then meet with my honourable friend. Now, he has done this, and he's to be commended for that. But I would just urge the Minister to raise this issue with his honourable friend, because not all of the problems that were identified had yet been resolved, and so it would be useful if that could be pursued as well. Turning to the issue of democracy and human rights, as I say, the catalogue of human rights abuses are well documented. The media and the political oppression are quite abhorrent to us in a free and democratic society. So the government is absolutely right to express its disgust at the human rights abuses in Belarus, and to do so through the various channels, through the EU and through the UN. And I would urge them to continue to put further pressure on the regime in Belarus where that's possible. And in particular, and I know this is something the government is keen to do, this must involve pressure to release the political prisoners, investigate the disappearance of political opponents, and hold free and fair elections, as well as lifting restrictions on the country's media. And so I do welcome the government's statements and actions on this to date, but I would just press the Minister further to say, what further actions would the government be considering to get this message through to Belarus? What other pressure can it bring to bear on the regime there, so that it will understand that its human rights abuses are absolutely unacceptable? It would also be interesting to know, and I don't know whether the Minister would have the figures here today, or if not, would perhaps be able to write to those members here, how many political opponents of the Belarusian regime have been given asylum in the UK in recent years, and indeed if any have applied for asylum and been refused. The Honourable Member for the Wrekin mentioned, of course, the forthcoming elections. Now, in last year's local elections, there was no international election monitoring, and so it is obviously vital, if we are to have any confidence there could be free and fair elections, that international monitors are granted access. So I'd be interested in the Minister's views, certainly, on whether he expects there to be election monitoring in the forthcoming elections, or whether there are still significant obstacles to that happening. I certainly would.
A question. There will be election monitors, and I understand the Belarusian government has agreed to it, and that some of them will be British.
That's very welcome news indeed, and perhaps even another sign of the slight thawing of relations, which we've noticed in some various places recently between Belarus and EU countries, which I hope provide a glimmer of hope for the future. On the media side, which again has been raised, this fills me with dismay when I read that the state-owned monopoly printers in 2005 terminated the contract of the last remaining independent daily newspaper, and that just last month new laws were brought in requiring all websites that are in Belarus to be registered with the government, and that journalists can actually be subject to tough penalties of actually being put in prison for 2 years if they reproduce foreign media reports that discredit Belarus. This is absolutely unacceptable, and indeed is the persecution of the religious groups, which we've also heard about, particularly the appalling treatment of Christians there, and these must be roundly condemned. I think the Honourable Member for Castle Point made a very good intervention to point out the role, an important role, of organisations like Amnesty International, of which I should declare an interest as being a member of that group. But surely for these organisations to be able to get into countries like Belarus and report accurately on what is happening is vital for those of us in the international community who wish to put pressure on such regimes to be able to do so. And I would commend and applaud the work that they do, and urge all MPs from all sides of the House to take an interest in the types of reports that they produce. Turning to relations with the EU, Mr Hancock, there has been a sort of twin-track approach of suspending the high-level contact with Belarus, but trying to keep the door open so that hopefully, if reforms do take place, there can be greater cooperation. We've had periods of sanctions, and then sanctions being lifted and then imposed again, and certainly with the recent crackdowns on political opponents and the restrictive legislation, and it's quite right that those sanctions have been put in place. I would be interested in the Minister's thoughts as to whether he thinks the current strategy is working and whether he thinks there's any alternative strategies and how effective he feels those sanctions are being. I note from a parliamentary answer back in November 2007 to my honourable friend, the member for Roxburgh and Berwickshire, that there was currently at that point no Belarusian assets that were frozen in the UK in line with the EU sanctions, and it would be good to know if that position has changed since then, or if it's still the case that there's no such assets that fall into that category. And I'm particularly interested in this perceived thawing of relations, with the European Commission being able to set up an office in Minsk, with clearly the acceptance of the election monitors for the forthcoming elections. Is there hope that this warming of relations could become more permanent, and what should the response of Europe be to make sure that that happens, while still managing to walk the balancing line, as it were, between wanting to encourage reform and not condoning the human rights abuses in the country? And finally, just turning to the relations between Belarus and Russia, it does seem, and it has been seen to be the case, that Lukashenko's prime objective in terms of foreign policy has been to have good relations with Russia, but clearly these have come under significant stress under the Putin presidency, particularly due to the many disputes over the gas and oil supplies and the impact that has on the Belarusian economy. Can the Minister say what talks the UK or EU is having with Belarus to avoid future disruption to energy supplies because of pipeline disputes? And obviously, with increasing dependence on other parts of the world for energy supplies, Belarus and Ukraine are both in pivotal positions as a major transit route for oil and gas supplies. Does the Minister think that a greater number of pipeline routes could decrease the likelihood and seriousness of any future disputes, and is this something the government would be actively pursuing to try and have alternative supply routes? And is there any further information he can give to us today about the government's action in that area? And finally, I think the interest in the relations thawing with the EU is also sort of counterbalanced by looking through the history of the Russian relations, of Russia at one point saying that Belarus should be part of the Russian Federation, and then other times the suggestion being mooted that they could be joined together in a united state. What's this proposal? What stage is that at? And does he believe that the warmer overtures towards the EU are perhaps a shift in policy from Lukashenko and moving away from that idea that had been floated of a united Belarus and Russian state? So on that note, Mr Hancock, I know we're fortunate, in fact, to have some more time than usual, perhaps, for the Minister to be able to respond after the Honourable Member for Rayleigh. So I look forward to hearing his reply to these various points.